New York. Ashlee Stephenson is a Republican strategist and president of Axe Advocacy, a friend of the program. Ashlee, welcome back. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me today.
So same question I posed to Pat Dennis. Who are the adults in the room? How do we move the needle? What's going to end this standoff?
Look, Democrats are so desperate for a political lifeline that they were willing to shut down the government to try to get some people to rally around their message. That's all that we see here. This is totally a political ploy from the left. And there are a lot of cracks when you look at the public opinion data. 62% in Harvard-Harris, Steve, say that they think Republicans are going to win the shutdown. 65% in the latest New York Times Siena poll said, look, Democrats shouldn't shut down the government even if their demands aren't met. So this is nothing more than a game of chicken with the Democratic Party just desperate to try to right-size themselves in an environment where they just continue to struggle to do so with the American public.
Do you have a sense of how this is going to play out in the two key governor's races in New Jersey? And of course, you and I are watching the ads here in the D.C. area in Northern Virginia, where Abigail Spanberger is hammering the lieutenant governor because of her support of President Trump and referring to this shutdown as a political wedge issue. The polling right now is showing that the Democrat is up 8-10 points. And of course, the election is still a month away. What is your sense politically in this off election year in the Commonwealth?
So I think as it relates to both New Jersey and Virginia, the thing of it is these elections are basically a lifetime away. I mean, in a normal world, Steve, if we're looking at a month out, you know, we're down to the last minute and people are doing everything they can, campaigns are, to convince voters of their messaging. People aren't remembering what happens week to week, much less over the course of roughly 4 weeks. So I think that there's a lot of time between now and New Jersey and Virginia that I really don't necessarily believe that the shutdown is going to impact the outcome of that election. What I will say in Virginia, and this is a little bit of a twist, I know it's not what you asked me, huge scandal out over the weekend with the Democratic Attorney General candidate who wanted to invoke political violence against a Republican. That's what needs to be talked about, and I think could have a ramification on that election, because that is incredibly serious and unbelievable, and Abigail Spanberger hasn't backed away from it.
And you're right about that, but you also have the president talking about the enemy within and referring to his enemies as scumbags. So how do we tone this down on all fronts?
I'll tell you what, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend that for those of us who work in politics, R's and D's, that are supporters of civility and optimism, everybody should go read this article. It talked about state legislators in 3 different states across the country, Republicans and Democrats, who are putting their differences aside to work together and to have good civil discourse. And I'll tell you what, Steve, in the middle of day 3 or 4 into the shutdown, that was a really positive thing to read, to recognize that there is civility among both parties. Folks in Washington who work together across the aisle regularly. It's just not what drives front page news and the cable channels at night to get people talking and excited. It's a little bit less interesting, if you will, but I'm very optimistic reading reports like that.
Well, we need more of that. I spent the weekend in Dallas with 8 former members of Congress, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and they talked about that issue. They talked about the need for civility. It was interesting. Even some of the Republican lawmakers were aghast at what President Trump was putting on Truth Social, because how do you negotiate when you're mocking basically Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer? And clearly there's a lot of rhetoric on both sides, so I'm not naive to that. But I'm just wondering from your standpoint, when the president is putting that on Truth Social, what do you think on the issue of civility, trying to come together and work out a compromise rather than name calling?
Well, the thing about this election cycle, whether it's New Jersey or Virginia or heading into 2026, it's really going to be about turnout, Steve. And what can both sides of the aisle do to get their bases motivated to participate? Today, it looks like Democrats think shutting down the government might get their troops fired up, those individuals who are perhaps less enthused with the way the Democratic Party has been operating over the last year. And we know for Trump Republicans especially, figuring out how to turn out that MAGA base that doesn't historically participate in an off-year election, maybe the more aggressive the rhetoric, it will remind those voters that they've got to get out and participate. So I really look at everything through the lens that it's a political means to an ends, as opposed to just at the very surface level. So I do think that there's a lot of focus on trying to excite the base from both sides of the aisle, and that's why you're seeing some of this discourse.
Including these AI-generated memes by the president?
Well, I don't know how to answer that, Steve. I don't know too much about the AI generated memes. I'm gonna be very honest about it. But look, the bottom line is people need to get their base motivated, and it's different today than it was 20 years ago. These are just facts.
We talked earlier with Lynn Sweet. She's a veteran reporter with Chicago Sun-Times about what's happening in Chicago. And I made the reference, Ashlee, because you and I have both studied history and politics, and we remember how Richard Nixon framed the campaign back in 1968 when it came to what we're seeing in cities and being tough on crime. On the political issue of what's happening with the National Guard in Portland, Oregon, Chicago, Washington, potentially New York City, and elsewhere, the courts are weighing in on all of this. But politically, where does this put your party? Where does this put the Democrats?
Well, I would say first, it's a political gift that cuts both ways. And let me explain that. First, for the president, he's at about 50% job approval, net positive in the latest Harvard-Harris, net positive on New York Times Siena on the issue handling of crime. So this is a political win for President Trump and certainly the Republican Party. And it's also a political win to shine a bright light on the unacceptable crime that's happening in our major cities, wonderful cities across the country. Today we're talking about Chicago. My goodness, can only even imagine what the conversation is going to be like on New York City once they elect potentially a Democratic socialist as a new mayor. So there's a political upside to it. The president is absolutely operating from a position of strength. Set the constitutional and the judicial piece aside. He is operating on a position of strength, which benefits him politically to be operating in this way. Second of this, I think it's a political gift for somebody like J.B. Pritzker, who is dying to be the one in the seat to get a chance to refute the president like Governor Gavin Newsom, who, by the way, I think has outlapped all of his potential 2028 opponents. So here's J.B. Pritzker's day in the sun to wag the finger at President Trump and try to get some attention for himself. But my goodness, I wouldn't want to have all the light shined on me for having such a poorly run city under my governorship. So, like I said, I think it's a gift that potentially could cut both ways. At the end of the day, without a doubt, President Trump and Republicans are the ones who politically come out ahead of this.
And of course, tied into all of this, you mentioned that Harvard-Harris poll, but the CBS News poll, when it comes to issues most important for the country, 27% say economy and the jobs, 21% say inflation, 15% say healthcare, crime and government spending way down the list at 9% each. What does that tell you?
That's right, way down the list, but who can win on those subset issues to motivate the base? And I think crime, and we saw this in the 2024 election and 2022, really after COVID, retail theft. It wasn't like this was something that people in the double digits were saying this is a top of mind issue for them. But Republicans had every advantage to point to retail theft and came out ahead in a lot of races by making that an issue. And I think that this is similar. It's a strong foundational ground for the Republican Party to be pointing the finger at crime and say we are tough on it, while these Democratic mayors, again, in places like Chicago and New York City on the horizon, have not gotten the job done. And even here in Washington have allowed their cities go to a pretty bad place that's required the National Guard to come in and try to clean some things up.
We're talking to Ashlee Rich Stephenson. She is president of Axe Advocacy and a Republican strategist. Ashlee, you talk to Republicans, lawmakers, strategists, insiders. What are you hearing in terms of the length of this shutdown? Clearly, with the House out this week, at least at the moment, presumably it will continue into next week, if not beyond. What do you think?
Well, I'm paying attention to when the next payroll will be for government employees. That's when things, Steve, really start to get uncomfortable. That's the week of the 12th. I'd be surprised if we don't come to a deal before then. It's just not good for anybody. And I'll end by saying it's really bad for small business. As much of the government shutdown is a political game of chicken for both parties, for those of us who care about business issues, fiscal responsibility, the government needs to function. And I think that both sides in Washington are going to listen to their constituents who say, hey, we've had enough of this nonsense. Get back to work for us, because both sides lose if they're not supporting small businesses across the country.
Well, look, you're a parent. I'm a parent. I tell my kids, get your homework done. That is task one. The job of Congress is to pass a budget, which, by the way, they haven't done on time in 3 decades. Just think about that. An interesting bit of trivia. Hey, Ashlee Rich Stephenson, thank you, as always, for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve. Enjoy being here.
Ashlee Rich Stephenson, Republican strategist, president of Axe Advocacy.